So I asked Sophie, Caroline, and Brett to spend some time during the manager's report to do a full debrief of the trial of Bowen, Maine, the three-way stop, to kind of go over what went well, what did not go well, what's next, and to address some of the feedback we've gotten from residents. I just want to say I really appreciate people's patience. Do I think it went perfectly? No, but I think that we learned a lot with really good data, and it gave us good insight for things that work and how we can do a better job with trials in the future. And I remain very glad that our town is willing to try things and adjust and be thoughtful about the future and try and be proactive. But I do want to acknowledge also that I did receive some feedback that calling it a successful trial felt a little, didn't really acknowledge some people's frustration. And I think that's fair feedback. And I think Brett will spend some time going over what was successful and what was a bit challenging. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilor Benoit. Brett Richardson, Development Director for the town, and here to do the recap, just as Joanna said. So I think just to echo what we just heard, the first and foremost is to thank the residents of Freeport on their patience through this process, and then also for the constructive feedback. Through that feedback, we learned a lot about what the issues were. Staff was able to respond fairly quickly, and we'll talk about what some of those issues were, what the responses were, and what we learned. But most importantly, thank you. It was an experiment to learn from. We learned a lot, thanks to the patients. So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about why we conducted the experiment, get a little context for this, what we measured, and to Joanna's point, what is success and what does that mean? Challenges and lessons learned, and then the next steps for the Village Corridor Initiative, which is a broader corridor that we're looking at, as well as the downtown intersections. So why are we experimenting in the downtown? I think it's important to kind of go back a little bit in time and remember the downtown vision plan, and a quote drawn directly from there, that in the last 10 years, changes in retail trends and the rise of online shopping resulted in vacancies in downtown Freeport retail storefronts increasing. So the community was starting to feel some pressure about what the downtown core, how it was performing, the vibrancy, and the result was the downtown vision. And we continue to hear the phrase in the economic development space and from other community organizations that Freeport's downtown economic ecosystem is fairly fragile. That graph on the left, it's subtle, but what it shows is the mix between commercial tax revenues relative to residential tax revenues. And over the last 10 years, commercial went from almost 30% of the town's tax revenues down to less than 20. And what that means is that a greater proportion of the burden is being bared by residences. So when we talk about experimenting downtown, it's about transportation, it's about placemaking, but it's also about economic vitality and having a sustainable community with a strong downtown core. And vacancies are down, but we're learning that commercial lease rates are also down, that shorter term leases are more common, that there's a trend towards percentage leases, meaning that businesses that are filling these vacant spaces are paying a percentage of their revenue as opposed to a fixed monthly rent, which is a benefit to them. And then there's a historical long-term leases at higher rents that were signed 10, 15 years ago that we're going to see continuing to expire. And the point here is that this Village Corridor Initiative, it builds on the downtown vision. It's about transportation, but it's really about the economic sustainability of Freeport. And so that's part of why we're experimenting, is to address that need.
Brad, can I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
Do you know the change in residential versus commercial, is that driven by lack of commercial activity, or is it also partly explained by valuations? And if so, do we know how
here, there's no question that there is some of that going on. but it's important to note the general trend line is really about 1% a year changing. So it's something that we need to be cognizant of. I think talking with Min, the assessor, that a really healthy ratio is about 75-25 or more, and we've dipped below that, and we're continuing to. So it's important. Great questions, great clarification. We can do more research on that. This is really just about to illustrate the trend. And this is a direct quote, too, about how the downtown vision was created with strong, robust public input. So the downtown vision grew out of the input from the people, 800 or more, who live here, who have deep roots in town, and who understand the nuances of the downtown. It was informed by experts who have seen and participated in revitalization in other towns, and it was guided by a dedicated team of employees and volunteers. So 2022, the downtown vision, this work to experiment at Main and Bow is really about doing work about that and trying to address these core challenges that we've known about as a community for a few years, if not more. It's also important to note, I think, that the Main and Bow Street intersection is at the focal point of downtown, but the Village Corridor Initiative is really looking at the corridor from Main Beer Company north to Upper Mass Landing Road. So this is one experiment to learn about how different traffic controls and different intersection configuration can work, but it was designed to inform our understanding of the broader corridor and how that plays together. So we learned a lot in a short period of time, again, thanks to the patience of the community. This is an ongoing effort, and we'll talk a little bit more about the next steps for this here in a few minutes. To revisit, the vision for this intersection came out of the 2022 Downtown Vision Plan with the idea that Main and Bow is really the heart of downtown, and that a fair amount of space is really devoted towards automobile traffic, and that there's an opportunity to strike a different balance that continues to respect automobile traffic and make sure that it flows smoothly, but also to balance the needs of pedestrians, downtown businesses, and bike ped folks as well. So this effort is again, something that's a few years old, and we're testing now to see if we can get to that vision. The quick build that we saw in the fall here, this speaks to the word success and what success means. Really what we were focused on is whether or not an all-way stop functioned from a traffic movement standpoint. So if folks heard the word success and were concerned that they saw vehicles blowing through a temporary stop sign, if they heard the word success and thought that traffic was backed up from Mallet Drive, those are issues, right? And when we said the word success, it wasn't to suggest that those weren't learnings. It was largely about the focus of the study, which was, did an all-way stop work for traffic flow? And based on the data that we counted, it did. It's not to discount the broader issues that we learned a lot about. It's really to focus on that one particular data point. And so if that message rang hollow a little bit because experiences were different at different points in time, that wasn't the point. The success was really focused on the point of the study, which was, does an all-way stop work? The issues, right? I think, we know about them. We experienced them. The traffic initially, the lanes were too tight. We started with a design from engineers. It was expensive to implement the full demonstration in the fall. So what we opted to do was a quicker, simpler test. And as that design migrated from the original full engineered design to the quick build, there were some issues that we learned about through experience that we didn't anticipate. Those turning lanes were too tight. The school buses had a challenge. The public safety vehicles had a challenge. If you've driven through there, you notice the posts. Folks found them confusing. There were a lot of colors at the eye level, and so there was a fair amount of visual clutter. That visual clutter wouldn't be in place in different iterations, future iterations, but if you're coming to this driving into the intersection and you don't know the backstory and you don't know the purpose of it and you experience that, there's no question that you would say, what is this and why are we doing this, right? There's a reason. It was to learn as quickly as we could and inexpensively as we could, but there's no question that the visual clutter was experienced by people and not always in a good way. And then public safety, access and passage. You know, we learned in those first couple days that a fire truck had a challenge getting through the main street. The good news is we can plan for that in the future and feel comfortable that we can address that. And then lastly, bus parking. Fall is a busy time of year with the leaf peepers who come to Maine. We had a lot of tour buses. That was increased because there were storms in the Caribbean, and some cruise ships were diverted from that to Maine. And so there was new operators and a fair amount of freelancing by tour buses. And they're critical to our downtown economy. We can plan for that with more time. So those were really, the big issues. And again, thanks to the community for providing that feedback, because it allowed Public Works to get out there, and they worked really hard and were quite responsive to remove posts, to adjust the intersection. And by about the 7th or 8th day, school buses were able to make the turns, delivery trucks were doing better, and it seemed to flow pretty well. So again, but that's having to do with good feedback and patience on the part of the public. So this is the big issues that we've learned, and already ideas are being generated to respond to those. Again, the key point here is that we designed this to learn whether or not an all-way stop would work from a traffic standpoint. And a successful trial does not mean that the trial is perfect in all situations. We learned that. And then findings, the all-way stop. We've done a few presentations here to this council on the data that we collected. We collected car queues. And what we found was that the all-way stop slowed traffic a little bit, but it didn't really degrade traffic in a big way. And we also had the opportunity to observe the all-way stop during the Fall Festival, when it was one of the busiest days I think Freeport's had in a number of years. And if you looked at the intersection at Main and West, and if you looked at the intersection at Mallet, the traffic lights, those were quite backed up. But the intersection at Main and Bow was flowing pretty smoothly, even though it had 3 times the volume of pedestrians that you'd see at a normal time, right? So that's a lot. There's 45 pedestrian events in a 15-minute. So every 20 seconds, a group of people were crossing, at a pedestrian crossing, and traffic flowed there. The issues were mitigated during the trial and can be eliminated in future designs. Again, large vehicles, location of pedestrian crosswalks, that's an important thing too. If you've noticed the Bow Street parking lot, how it's kind of set down Bow Street a little bit, if we were to do this again, that pedestrian crossing would be moved up to the intersection, which would open up sightlines. You move the posts so there's not the visual clutter. You move the pedestrian crosswalk up, all of a sudden the visuals are much wider and safer. Public safety vehicle access, big priority, and then the tour and Breeze bus stops to make sure that we're thinking about that. And then I think a silver lining, when we were talking about this initially, there was a number of residents who accessed downtown by using Bow, and they were quite worried about what this would mean for their access. And what we found is that flow from Bow onto Main dramatically improved, because there were openings based on the stop signs that allowed that traffic from Bow to move pretty quickly. We also learned that, and Earl's not here, but hats off to him, that trials take a lot of staff time and effort. We originally talked about this as being simple. DOT provided the equipment, so the cost would be low. But due to those learnings and the staff time that was invested in iterating and making moves, nothing is quite simple with trials. And then the last point, we pulled it a little bit early, a week or two earlier than the original goal. And we, I think, made that decision or recommendation because we'd essentially learned as much as we could from that current iteration. Recognizing that the challenges existed, the visual clutter was there, we had accomplished the goal of determining whether an all-way stop worked. Once that was determined, it made sense to pull it. So the next steps, with the caveat around the word success, that, again, one more time, thanks to the community for the patience, that success wasn't to exacerbate anybody's frustrations. It was really just to communicate that the point of the study had been met, and that was whether or not an all-way stop worked. So Stantec, as part of this broader initiative with Maine DOT, they're wrapping up current conditions. So they're analyzing that corridor from Maine Beer Company to Upper Mass Landing Road. They're identifying where some of the hot spots are for collisions. They're looking at where there's gaps in the sidewalk service. There's looking at gaps and opportunities to fill in bike lanes. So we're going to have a good baseline about what the corridor looks like now and where the gaps are in the next couple months. We're continuing to evaluate the downtown intersection trials for spring of 2026 based on what we learned this fall and based on the feedback from the community, including school in Maine is a priority there. You know, that's one of the crash hotspots based on the historical data. And it's a scary intersection for pedestrians. There's a lot of traffic there. So the opportunity to take what we learned at Main and Bow and include School Street in that is an opportunity that seems like low-hanging fruit that we're hearing from feedback from the engineers, from DOT, from the public. We're currently also looking at the land around the Route 1 corridor to understand what kind of development we could see over there on that corridor over time, and that helps us plan for any new traffic that would be generated by that. So the idea is to understand, not to plan for the corridor of today, but to plan for the corridor of 20 years from now, so that we can manage that traffic in a smooth way and maintain the levels of service that we're all accustomed to. So we'll have some more information about what type of units could fit where, what that means for the corridor, probably later this year, towards the end of this year, if not early January. And then the idea is to have a check-in with the council, a joint workshop with the Complete Streets Committee, who sort of is the staff committee for this effort because it has to do with roads and bike ped safety, to do that in late January, early February, and to bring back designs, to bring back new iterations based on what we learned to move forward. Happy to take questions.
Anything from the council? Any thoughts on how it went?
Thanks, Brett. I'm sure you're ready for year 2 of your DOT graduate degree. Traffic engineering stuff. I didn't hear a whole lot other than maybe there's email traffic that some of us got to all counselors. Thanks for clarifying the definition of the term success. And I think, you know, some of that, maybe a considerable portion of that feedback, at least from my perspective, sort of reflects also that we can do a better job about communicating why we're doing these things in advance, or at least, you know, to the degree that we can make an effort to try and do that. And I think part of maybe the biggest thing that we missed was not illustrating that it is or was an experiment. I think people thought this, you know, fell out of the sky from Mars and it was here to stay and not sure what was going to happen. And so we can be a little bit more forward thinking about that going forward. But I'm glad to hear that, you know, the traffic conclusion is the three-way stop doesn't significantly impede traffic. In fact, maybe perform better than traffic lights, which is actually, I think, kind of a rationalization that's coming around in a lot of different areas from traffic planning. A few things that I go to where those folks are talking.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to reiterate a point that Brett has made several times, you know, this wasn't just Freeport deciding to do this. This is with Maine Department of Transportation, with national partners. You know, the metrics of success are well defined in best practice. And the downtown vision and our comprehensive plan, you know, this is based on years of planning. It didn't just come out of nowhere. And having these partnerships line us up for funding opportunities that mean we can actually do them in a cost-effective way. So, yeah.
And we should emphasize the point that Brett made in the beginning of the presentation, that it wasn't only about let's put stop signs on Main Street and say, great job, and pat ourselves on the back, but it's in support of the larger vision about reclaiming that whole area, right? So nobody loves the little tiny narrow sidewalk in front of Patagonia or the one in front of the Yellow Bean windows. If we can do more with those sidewalks and that vast expanse of asphalt outside the restaurant, like there's a lot we can do with that area. The stop signs are just a piece of that, and we need to know if that's a tool that we could use. So I think when people see that larger vision start to be implemented, there'll be a lot more, I'm hoping, there'll be a lot more excitement.
Yeah. And it was not a pretty intersection for those couple of weeks, and that's unavoidable for sure. Yeah. All right, any